My father looked me straight in the eye and said, "You'll walk down that aisle alone." That was the night before my wedding. Can you even imagine hearing that from your own father? On the eve of the most important day of your life, the man who was supposed to be right there, holding your arm, refused. Not quietly, not reluctantly, but coldly, like he was closing a door forever. The next morning, I stood at the back of the chapel. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, louder than the organ warming up. Everyone had already taken their seats. The air smelled of roses and polished wood, and right there, in the front row, was a chair, empty, reserved for my father. A chair that told the entire room exactly what he thought of me. Have you ever felt hundreds of eyes scanning your face, trying to read how broken you are? That's what it felt like. People whispered. I caught fragments. Even her dad won't walk with her. That's so sad. Their pity clung to me heavier than the veil on my head. I could feel it pressing down, every step I hadn't yet taken. I tightened my grip on the bouquet. My palms were sweating, but I smiled. A small, strange smile. And I know what you're thinking. Why on earth would anyone smile at that moment? Why didn't I just collapse, cry, scream? Anything. Because I had a secret. A secret my father didn't know. And that secret was the only reason I could keep standing upright. I glanced toward the pews again. My fiancé Luis was waiting at the altar, his face steady, his shoulders squared, like he was carrying the both of us. But between us stretched that aisle, long, endless, a gauntlet of judgment, every pair of eyes ready to measure me against the shadow of the man who wasn't there. My heels clicked against the stone floor. Step, whisper, step, pity, step, judgment. Each sound echoed louder in my chest. Have you ever been in a room so silent you can hear people breathe? That's how it was. Only the occasional cough, the rustle of a dress, the murmured question, "Where's her father?" I lifted my chin higher. If he thought leaving me would break me, he was wrong. Still, that empty chair pulled at me like gravity. Every time I looked forward, it tugged at the corner of my vision, whispering that I wasn't good enough, that I was unwanted, unworthy. I asked myself, right there, what's worse? Walking alone or walking with someone who doesn't want you by his side? And honestly, walking alone felt lighter, harder, yes, but lighter. The aisle seemed longer than any street I'd ever walked in Brooklyn. Longer than every drill, every deployment, every night staring at the ceiling wondering if I would ever be good enough for him. That aisle became the sum of every rejection, and yet step by step I owned it. I saw an old neighbor shake her head. I saw one of my cousins wipe away a tear. I saw people lean close to each other, whispering things they thought I couldn't hear, but I heard enough, and I kept smiling. Because that smile wasn't about denial, it was about defiance. It was about holding on to the truth I carried inside me, the truth my father had no idea about. And here's where I want to stop and ask you, what would you do? If the person who should be your greatest supporter chose that exact moment, the one day meant to be filled with joy, to make his rejection public, what would you do? Would you crumble, or would you walk anyway? I walked, alone, but not defeated. And that empty chair? It became the loudest statement in the chapel, louder than any sermon, louder than any vow. It screamed his absence, his judgment, his refusal. But it also screamed something else. This is not the end of the story. Because while everyone else saw a bride abandoned, I knew something they didn't. I knew why I could still hold my head high. I knew why I could still smile. When you see me walking down that aisle alone, you might think that was the first time my father had turned his back on me. But it wasn't. It was just the loudest, most public version of something he'd been doing my whole life. Growing up in Brooklyn, my house was full of trophies, not mine, my brother Mark's. Baseball medals, framed certificates, pictures of him shaking hands with NYPD officers at youth events. Every time Dad looked at him, there was this light in his eyes, this pride that filled the room, and every time he looked at me, it was like I wasn't even there. You know how kids will do anything for their parents' attention? I was that kid. I'd bring home drawings, straight-A report cards, stories I'd written. He barely glanced at them, but if Mark hit a home run, Dad would shout so loud the neighbors would hear. The message was clear. Mark was the future. I was extra. When I told Dad I wanted to join the Navy, I'll never forget his face. He didn't shout. He didn't even argue. He laughed. A short, sharp laugh that said more than words ever could. The Navy? That's not a Johnson's path. You'll regret it. Those were his only words. I remember lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling, my stomach in knots. But inside, a spark burned. If he thought I couldn't do it, I would prove him wrong. And here's the thing. Joining the Navy wasn't rebellion for me. It wasn't about running away from his shadow. It was about finding my own light. But in his eyes, it was betrayal. Every phone call after that was cold. Every holiday dinner, he'd talk to Mark about precinct life, promotions, the real service in blue uniforms. Me? He'd change the subject, pretend I hadn't spoken. Silence became his weapon, and silence cuts deeper than shouting ever could. Years later, when I met Luis, I thought maybe things would change. Luis was warm, kind, patient. A teacher who believed in people, even when they didn't believe in themselves. I brought him home, introduced him to my family. Mom smiled. Mark shook his hand politely. Dad? He nodded once, then walked into the kitchen. Do you know that sting? When the person you love most is invisible to the person who raised you? Luis squeezed my hand under the table. He whispered later, It's not about me, it's about him. He was right, but it still hurt. When Luis proposed, I hesitated, not because I doubted him, but because I knew what my father's reaction would be. I could hear it before it happened, that same cold voice, that same wall of silence. And sure enough, when I told him, he didn't congratulate me. He didn't ask about the date or the dress. He said, Don't expect me to walk with you. Those words, they weren't new. They were just louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. Here's the question I want to ask you. What do you do when the person who should be proud of you decides you're a disgrace? Do you bend yourself to fit their idea of you, or do you keep going, even if it means walking alone? That's the choice I faced again and again. My father saw loyalty in Mark and betrayal in me. He saw honor in a badge, but dishonor in a uniform with anchors. And he saw my love for Luis not as joy, but as another reason to disapprove. The stakes were never just about me. It was about family, about dignity, about the right to stand on my own 2 feet without shame. I know many of you watching this have felt it too. That moment when your own family makes you feel like an outsider in your own home. It leaves scars. Invisible ones, and you carry them into every relationship, every decision, every dream. But scars don't have to be chains. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, by a parent, by a teacher, by someone who was supposed to believe in you, then you know exactly what I carried with me into that chapel. That weight, that silence. That empty chair wasn't just about my wedding. It was about decades of being unseen. And yet, here's the twist. Every rejection became fuel. Every silence became a challenge. Every absence became proof that I could stand anyway. So when I tell you I walked with my head high, it wasn't because I forgot the pain. It was because I remembered it. I carried it. And I refused to let it define me anymore. That's the shadow of my childhood. And stepping into that chapel was my way of finally walking out of it. If you've ever felt that shadow in your own life, stay with me. Because what happened next? It flipped everything upside down. The organ swelled and the room shifted. Everyone turned. I felt every gaze on me like a spotlight, hot and unrelenting. The veil framed my face, but it didn't hide the truth. I was walking down the aisle alone. No father at my side, no steady arm to hold. Just me, the length of the chapel, and that empty chair shouting louder than any choir. Whispers rippled through the pews. You know how sound carries in a church? Every hushed word bounces off the walls, echoing, magnified. Where's her dad? Isn't he supposed to? I heard he refused. Words cut like glass, even when spoken softly, and I kept walking, 1 step, 2 steps. Heels striking stone, the click reverberating like a countdown. Everywhere I looked, eyes followed, some pitied, some judged, some smirked, like they had been waiting for this exact spectacle. My cousin bit her lip. An aunt leaned close to whisper into another's ear. Even strangers, people who barely knew me, felt entitled to fill the silence with their own narratives. And there it was again, the empty chair, front row, decorated with a ribbon, reserved for the man who chose not to show. It glared back at me, a constant reminder that his absence wasn't private anymore. It was public. It was theater. And I was the main act. I forced a smile, thin but deliberate. Did you ever smile just to survive? To trick yourself into believing you weren't about to crumble? That's what I did. Inside, my stomach twisted. My heart rattled against my ribs. But on the outside, I gave them a look that said, I'm still here. Still, the weight pressed down. I heard one woman whisper, poor girl, as if I was helpless, pitiful, broken. Do you know how suffocating it feels to be defined by someone else's absence? To have your worth measured by who refuses to stand beside you? The aisle stretched endlessly. Luis was at the altar, steady, his eyes locked on me. He wasn't pitying. He wasn't embarrassed. He was waiting, solid, like a lighthouse in a storm, and that's what pulled me forward, step by step. But the whispers still trailed behind me, sticky, clinging. I remembered flashes. My father praising Mark for a baseball game, for an A in math, for being a real man. I remembered bringing home my Navy acceptance letter, only to watch him toss it aside like junk mail. Those moments stitched together led right here to this aisle, to this chair, to this walk. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn to the rows of faces and say, you don't know me. You don't know what I've done, what I've fought for. But instead, I kept walking, because sometimes silence isn't weakness, sometimes silence is armor. Do you see it now? Why I smiled. Not because I was happy, not because I wasn't hurting, but because that smile was my shield. If I had cried, they would have nodded knowingly, confirming their gossip. If I had faltered, they would have said, see, she can't stand without him. But smiling? That confused them. That unsettled them. A woman near the front leaned to her neighbor and whispered, why is she smiling? And I caught that whisper, sharp as a pin. Why indeed? That was the question I wanted them to choke on. Because what they didn't know was that this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a different one. And while they saw humiliation, I knew something bigger was coming. I reached the halfway point of the aisle, the weight heavier now. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe. My bouquet trembled slightly in my hands. I thought for a split second that I might faint. But then I locked eyes with Luis again. His look steadied me, anchored me. Every judgmental glance, every whispered pity, every smirk, it all became background noise. I let it wash over me, because deep down, I knew something they didn't, something even my father didn't. So let me ask you, What would you do if the world was waiting for you to crumble? Would you give them the satisfaction? Or would you hold your head higher, smile wider, and make them wonder what secret you were holding? I chose to smile, and in that smile was defiance. In that smile was the promise of a moment that was about to shatter every assumption in that room. The whispers still clung to the air when I reached the altar. My smile hadn't wavered, though my heart was pounding like a drum inside my chest. Luis reached for my hand, grounding me, steadying me. But before the vows could begin, the chapel doors creaked open. Every head turned. The hush was instant, and then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing against the stone floor. A man in uniform, crisp whites, rows of medals catching the light. Rear Admiral Stevens. Do you know that moment when time seems to stop? When you realize something's about to shift and every fiber of your being braces for it? That's what I felt. He walked with authority, shoulders squared, chin lifted. The congregation shifted, whispers now rippling with recognition. My father's absence had been the loudest thing in the room, but suddenly Stevens's presence swallowed it whole. He reached the front, stopped just steps away from me, and then, in a voice that carried to the rafters, he said, "Before this ceremony continues, there's an announcement that cannot wait. Today, we honor not only a union, but a remarkable career." My breath caught, my chest tightened. What was happening? Stevens turned to me. His eyes were steady, respectful. "Lieutenant Natalie Johnson, by the authority vested in me, it is my honor to inform you of your promotion to Rear Admiral. Effective immediately." Gasps filled the chapel. People rose from their seats, craning their necks, stunned. The same mouths that had whispered pity just minutes earlier now opened wide in disbelief, and then applause. It began as a ripple, a few claps from the back, but it grew, rolling forward like a wave. Soon the entire room was on its feet, clapping, cheering, faces alight with awe. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness but from the sheer whiplash of the moment. 1 second I was the girl walking alone, pitied, whispered about. The next, I was standing taller than I ever had, my name tied forever to a title I had fought for, earned, bled for. And my father? I saw him, standing stiff in the corner, his face pale, his mouth pressed into a thin line. The man who refused to walk me down the aisle couldn't even move now. He was frozen. And in that silence, I felt the balance of power shift. The chair he left empty no longer screamed humiliation. It stood now as a monument to his own choice, his absence overshadowed by something greater. Louise squeezed my hand again, whispering, "That's you! That's who you are!" The crowd's energy pulsed, filling the chapel with a new rhythm. The sting of whispers evaporated, replaced with cheers, claps, shouts of congratulations. I felt something break loose inside me, a weight lifting, chains snapping. Do you see it? The irony? My father's rejection had set the stage for my greatest recognition. His silence had amplified the sound of applause. His refusal had drawn attention to my walk, so when the announcement came, it hit harder, resonated deeper. For the first time in my life, I wasn't defined by his disapproval. I was defined by my own merit. I looked at him just once. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched, but he said nothing. What could he say? Every word would have sounded small against the roar of the crowd. That's when I realized sometimes justice doesn't arrive in the form of revenge. Sometimes it arrives in the form of undeniable truth. And in that moment, the truth was on my side. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you'd never measure up, imagine the look on their face when the world applauds you. That's the power of a moment like this. That's why I smiled, really smiled this time, as I turned back to Luis. The ceremony resumed, but the atmosphere was different now. I wasn't the bride abandoned by her father. I was Rear Admiral Natalie Johnson, standing tall in front of everyone who had ever doubted me. And here's what I want to ask you. How many times have you carried someone else's judgment like a chain, only to discover later it was never yours to carry? That was my revelation, right there at the altar. The whispers had ended. The loop was closed. But I didn't know then. Another was about to open. The wedding was over. The applause still echoed in my ears, as if the walls themselves were reluctant to let it fade. My cheeks ached from smiling, but deep down, I was trembling. Not from nerves anymore, but from the sheer relief of having survived it all. We cut the cake, posed for pictures, and said our thank yous. People hugged me tighter than usual, their voices warm with pride. And yet, even in all that noise, I felt the empty space where my father should have been. Later, when the last guests left and the lights dimmed, my mother slipped into the quiet room where I was gathering my things. She didn't look like a guest anymore. She looked like a woman carrying something heavy. Her eyes were softer, almost apologetic. She held a small envelope in her hand, yellowed at the edges, creased as if it had been folded and refolded 100 times. "Natalie," she whispered, "there's something you should know. Something I should have told you long ago." I stared at the envelope. My name wasn't written on it. Instead, it bore my father's. In faded ink, my pulse quickened. "Mom, what is this?" I asked, my voice tight. Her hand trembled as she passed it to me. "A letter. From years ago. He never meant for you to see it, but I can't keep it from you anymore." My fingers shook as I broke the seal. The paper crackled, fragile, almost brittle. And then I saw the words. It was addressed to the Navy. My father, Thomas, had once applied. He had once dreamed of wearing the uniform, of serving with honor. But the reply, neatly tucked inside, was rejection. He had failed the physical. He hadn't been accepted. I froze. My father, the man who spat venom every time I mentioned the Navy, who called me a traitor for joining, had once tried to be part of it himself, and he had been denied. Do you see the hypocrisy, the cruelty of it? He punished me for walking a path he once longed for but couldn't claim. He carried his bitterness like a weapon, and he used it on me. My mother sat down beside me. "He never forgave himself," she said softly. "And instead of facing that pain, he buried it. He redirected it. I couldn't breathe. My chest burned. My father's rejection of me wasn't about me at all. It was about him, his failure, his shame, his wound that never healed." I folded the letter back into the envelope, my hands clammy. Part of me wanted to tear it apart, to burn it, to erase every trace. But another part knew this was bigger than me. And then the phone buzzed. A cousin had already heard. Somehow, the letter had slipped into the wrong hands before I even saw it. A text blinked on the screen. "Is it true? Your dad was rejected by the Navy. Everyone's talking about it." My stomach dropped. Within hours, it spread, social media posts, whispers in the veteran community, neighbors calling neighbors. What had been a private secret became public gossip. Some pitied him, others mocked him, and some started to question everything he had said about me. The man who refused to walk his daughter down the aisle, who sneered at her career, was suddenly exposed as someone who once wanted exactly what she had. The irony burned like fire. Luis found me staring at the letter, my phone buzzing nonstop on the table. "You didn't do this," he reminded me. "This isn't your fault. But tell me, how do you stop guilt from creeping in when your father's shame is unraveling in front of the whole community?" That night, I lay awake replaying the moment I first read his words, the rejection, the bitterness hidden behind every insult he ever threw at me. The truth gnawed at me. My father's cruelty wasn't just cruelty, it was projection. And now, everyone knew it. You think closure comes with applause, but sometimes it opens a darker door. And here's where I need you to stay with me. Because what started as my wedding day triumph was about to spiral into a battle much uglier, much louder. My father wouldn't let this end here, and neither would I. So let me ask you, what would you do if the very man who tore you down was suddenly stripped bare in front of everyone? Would you protect him or let the truth speak for itself? Stay, because this story isn't over. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon. The town hall had been dressed for the annual ceremony honoring retired officers. Flags hung from the rafters. A brass band warmed up in the corner. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly with familiar faces, neighbors, veterans, their families. And in the middle of it all, I felt the air thicken, the weight of whispers trailing me like shadows. Everyone had heard. The letter wasn't just a rumor anymore. It had become a storm. And standing on that stage was my father, Thomas Carter, polished shoes, chest out, face carved from stone. For a moment, it looked like nothing had changed. He still carried himself with the pride of a man who never bent. But then he spoke. His voice was sharp, carrying across the hall with the same authority I had once admired as a child. "My daughter," he said, pausing deliberately, "has chosen to dishonor me, to dishonor all of us. She has dragged my name through the mud for her own glory." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded. Others shook their heads. The air split in two. I stood in the aisle, my fingers tight around the envelope. The letter burned against my palm as if it were alive. My pulse pounded in my ears. He kept going. She used lies to elevate herself. She paraded her so-called achievement in front of you, hiding behind the Navy's applause. But she has forgotten where she comes from. She has forgotten respect. I felt dozens of eyes on me, some filled with pity, some sharp with judgment, and some looked like they were waiting for me to fight back. Do you know what it's like when the person who raised you becomes your accuser in front of a crowd? Every insult I had swallowed over the years seemed to echo louder in that hall. My breath caught. I wanted to scream, to defend myself, to show everyone the letter, to shout the truth. But then I remembered. This wasn't just about me. It was about the stakes that stretched wider. Family honor, my father's pride, my own dignity. The hall grew tense. Murmurs spread. A woman in the front row whispered, "Is it true?" Did she make it up? Someone else countered, "No, he's covering. Look at her." The walls seemed to close in. My chest tightened. I heard Luis's voice somewhere behind me, steady, urging me without words. My father's eyes locked on mine, cold and unflinching. "Natalie," he boomed, "if you have any respect left for this family, you will admit your lies, right here, right now." The silence that followed was deafening. I took a step forward. My heels clicked against the floor, each sound magnified. My hands shook, but I didn't let the envelope drop. The crowd leaned in. Even the band stopped shuffling. And then it hit me. Every choice I made from this moment on would define not just me, but how everyone saw him, saw us. The stakes had never been higher. I swallowed hard. My voice cracked, but I forced it out. "Do you really want me to read this?" I held the letter up, just high enough for everyone to see the edges, the faded ink. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "She has it." Another voice said, "What's in it?" The pressure was unbearable. My father stiffened, his jaw clenched, his fists curled at his sides. He knew exactly what was inside. I looked at the audience, their faces a mosaic of expectation and doubt, then back at him. And for a split second, I was 10 years old again, desperate for his approval. But this wasn't about approval anymore. This was about truth. The crowd leaned forward, hanging on the edge of the moment. Some wanted blood. Some wanted resolution. Everyone wanted something. And here's the part you need to understand. I didn't know which way I would go until that very second. My hand trembled. My lips parted. The entire hall held its breath, waiting for me to either expose my father or protect him. So I'll ask you, what would you have done? Held on to the letter? Or let the truth spill out? The letter was still in my hand. The room was still holding its breath. My father's face, set, rigid, defiant, was the only thing I could see through the blur of dozens of watching eyes. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might give out right there. But then, silence stretched so long it broke something in me, and suddenly I knew. I knew the choice wasn't about punishing him or proving myself to the crowd. It was about me, about who I wanted to be when I walked out of that hall. I lowered the envelope. A ripple of disbelief swept through the audience. Someone whispered, "She's not going to." Another voice hushed them. The tension was electric. I looked at my father and said, steady this time, "No one has the right to turn their wounds into someone else's burden, not even you, not even me." The hall fell silent again, but this silence was different. It wasn't expectant, it wasn't hungry, it was heavy, reflective. I tucked the letter back into my pocket. "This ends here," I said softly. For a second, I thought my father would explode, shout again, accuse me of weakness. But instead, he froze. His jaw loosened. His eyes flickered. Anger, confusion, and then something harder to name. Shame, maybe. Recognition. He didn't say a word. He just bowed his head. And that was the moment I realized I wasn't fighting him anymore. I wasn't even fighting the crowd. I was standing for myself. I heard the shuffle of chairs as people leaned back, as if they too had let out a breath they'd been holding. One by one, heads nodded, not in pity, not in judgment, but in understanding. Luis's hand found mine, warm, steady. I glanced at him and saw pride shining in his eyes. Not the kind of pride that screams or demands attention, but the quiet kind that tells you you're finally free. I turned back to the audience. "We all carry scars," I said. My voice was firmer now, louder. "But they don't have to define the ones we love. They don't have to be passed down like chains. No one clapped, no one spoke." The stillness was almost holy. And then, slowly, as if moved by something deeper than words, people began to nod again. A murmur of agreement spread through the hall. My father stayed still, his head bowed. For the first time in my life, I didn't crave his approval. I didn't need his permission. I had given myself mine. And in that realization, I felt a lightness I'd never felt before. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was release. When I walked out of the hall, the sun hit my face, warm and blinding. Luis squeezed my hand, and I smiled. Not the polite smile I'd practiced for years, but something real, unguarded. Behind me, the crowd was still quiet, processing. But I knew they'd remember, not because I exposed anyone, not because I won an argument, but because I chose a different ending. And if you've ever carried someone else's shadow, if you've ever been told you had to live beneath their pain, you know how heavy that is. And maybe, just maybe, you also know what it means to set it down. I didn't walk away as the daughter of Thomas Carter, the man who refused me, accused me, and tried to bend me to his will. I walked away as myself, whole, free. And if this story has touched you, if you've ever longed for that moment of release, I want you to share it. Share it for yourself, for someone you love, or for someone who needs to hear that they can choose differently. Because freedom doesn't come from winning against others. It comes from choosing not to let their wounds define you. That was my ending, my freedom. And it can be yours too.